everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff with Economics Matters. I'm speaking with you 2 days after the election, and I thought I would spend some time talking about the true state of the economy and uh, how this relates to you personally. So uh, I think a lot of people were surprised at how one-sided the election turned out to be. And clearly, I think the economy, people's personal economies played a large part in that. People are frustrated. And I think every day when you go to the grocery store or to a restaurant and people have to eat, obviously every day, so they go shopping several times a week, or go to a restaurant for a sandwich, and it becomes a $20 experience to have a hamburger. Then you repeatedly get the sense that there's something uh, wrong in your own personal economic life. Even if you're pretty high income, even if you can afford the $20 hamburger, just doesn't feel like it should be. And maybe that was, at the simplest level, what was uh, the best explanation for what happened here, that people just are not happy about their personal economic situation, and they're worried about whether or not, anything's going to turn around and how that can be impacted, and even voting for someone who's not crystal clear about what they're going to do uh, is better than voting for someone who seems to be just going to continue same old, same old. So no one is ever going to know exactly what motivated uh, tens of millions of Americans to vote the way they did. But we can talk about the reality of our national economic situation and our personal economic situation for a little bit, and may provide some insight into what you should do personally, but also give you some idea about what the true state of the world is, economically speaking, for the country, and what we really need policy-wise. What I was struck by during the election was how little substance um, there was uh, in the discussion. Clearly, um, President Trump had a lot of uh, negative uh, things to say about a lot of people, a lot of threatening things, scared a lot of people on the left. People on the right reacted that what he was saying was going to really happen. Uh, Nobody knows for sure what he fully intends. So I would say he was just, throwing up a lot of uncertainty about the future. Uh, Vice President Harris was proposing reforms which were not fundamental. She didn't seem to have any clear foreign policy to speak of, except a continuation of what had happened. So people were, I think, between here and there, not knowing who would be the better choice. And maybe they decided to look at that hamburger cost, or that, you know, cost of whatever it was they were buying in the supermarket that seemed outrageous, and decided they would just go for something that might be different without knowing exactly what it would be. But what we didn't hear during the election was any discussion of the true economic situation of the country, the post-war uh, economic history of the country, where we stand. Are we improving? Are we um, getting worse on a lot of dimensions? Uh, so I want to talk you through that by going through some slides, showing you some facts. That's one thing we didn't hear during the election any real facts about anything, um, except for distortions. There were a lot of things asserted, but without any evidence. Nobody said, well, this is true and here's the source. It was always, this is true, just take it from me. And wild accusations or statements. Um, so I think it's time for us to face some economic realities about our economy, our nation, and its position in the world, and also uh, our personal situations and how we can address them, even if the federal government is not going to help us or might even make things worse. So let me talk a bit about this again from the perspective of some data. And for those of you who are listening as opposed to watching, I'm going to talk to you about what I'm showing on slides here. Let me make sure I've shared the screen. I think I have to make sure I do that. Here we go. Okay, so I think we now are sharing the screen, and so I put together a little slide presentation, uh, and it's entitled Talking National and Personal Economics Post-Election. And of course, I'm an economics professor at Boston University. If you're not familiar with if this is the first time you're coming to Economics Matters, the podcast, if you just shoot an email to me at kotlikoff@gmail, I will be happy to sign you up for the rest of your life for a personal subscription to a free subscription to this newsletter and podcast. There's also something called the Financial Riddler, which is a kind of a bi-monthly financial quiz that you might find fun. So you'll get that. And then if you want to contribute to helping support this educational provision, economic educational endeavor, you can become a subscriber, and I encourage you to do that. Also talk a lot about personal finance. I have a personal financial planning software company. We have a tool called maxifyplanner.com, maxify.com, which can do marvelous things to help you make economic decisions personally, save you taxes, raise your lifetime Social Security benefits, help you decide things like when to retire, whether you can afford to get divorced, whether you should be switching jobs, whether you should be engaging in a Roth conversion and exactly how much in each year, when to start taking your retirement account money. All these things have tax implications. Whether you can afford to send your child, or whether your child can afford to attend this college or that college, and take out this size student loan or not, or major in this subject or not, whether you should keep working at 70 and how that will affect your Social Security benefits, because you can raise them if you keep working and earn enough. So all kinds of questions that we have to answer, how to think about uh, what might happen to Social Security, given that it's literally broke in terms of the projections, uh, and how to respond to that. All these things are important. So we can't keep our heads in the sand, and that's what most people are doing when it comes to personal finance. So let me talk about some overarching questions in this first slide here. So first question I have is, our country going broke? Nobody addressed that in the election, but I think we are. And I think we've been going broke for many decades. As a post-war policy, we've been heading downhill, fiscally speaking. Are many of us personally going broke? Talk about that. And how do we change course nationally and personally? Well, another way to express this kind of national question is with this question, is the U.S. On a slow road to Argentina? Argentina was a very rich country in terms of per capita GDP a century ago. If you look back in 1920, they had a per capita GDP which was 85% of the US level. They're about the fifth uh, richest country measured in terms of per capita GDP in the world. Maybe not the fifth, maybe it was the 10th, but they were in the top 10. And what happened is that over time, they engaged in a lot of terrible policy. And today, their ratio of per capita GDP to the US is not 85%, as it was in 1920, but it's only 14%. So they've taken a century to go downhill in terms of economic progress. They've, they've fallen, and it's been a steady process. One government after the other adopting terrible policy, lots of financial defaults, bank runs, hyperinflations, and we now have a president in Argentina is trying to turn this around, President Milei, with some radical reforms. I wish him luck, and I think he does have a chance to succeed, but it's not going to be an easy matter for sure. They've dug themselves a huge hole. Anyway, what about the U.S.? Well, our post-war fiscal policy has been marked by expropriating our children, from taking from young savers and giving to old spenders. You didn't hear this from Vice President Harris. She didn't say, well, you know what we've been doing in the post-war has been systematically expropriating our children and telling them not to worry, they'd have a chance to do the same thing to their children once they got older. But that's the truth, and you didn't hear this from President-elect Trump either. But that's what's happened, and it has a lot to do with the macroeconomic trends. So how do we actually expropriate our children in our via our fiscal policy? Well, we periodically cut taxes and borrow, so we raise our official debt. We spend more and borrow. In other words, we increase our spending. If you think about the spending during COVID, lots of spending to try and bail out the economy. That was a good thing, but then we didn't ask current older generations to pay that. We just loaded up on government debt and left the bills for our kids and grandkids and great-grandkids to cover. We've expanded the Social Security system dramatically in the post-war. When President Eisenhower took office, the payroll tax was something like 1.5%. He left it about 3 times higher. Today, the payroll tax rate is not 1.5 or 3% percentage points, but it's 12.4 percentage points. And then, of course, we have a Medicare payroll tax, which is another 2.7 percentage points. And then there are even higher additional payroll tax rates that are levied on people that have high income, both on labor income and on asset income. One's a 0.9% payroll tax rate if your labor income's high enough to pay for Medicare. And then there's a 3 percentage point or so payroll tax rate to pay for Medicare as well, but that's levied on asset income. So we've run these programs as pay-as-you-go. That's what we call them. We take money from young people and give it to old people. So that's basically a Ponzi scheme where you run a chain letter where you take some money from somebody and say, don't worry, here's a piece of paper. You can sell that to the next kid in the next desk in your classroom, and give me $1 and then for this piece of paper, and then take that piece of paper and give it to the next kid and say, give me $2 for this piece of paper. I paid $1 you'll be able to sell that piece of paper for $4 to the next kid in the class, and you'll get $4 back for the $2 you sold it for. So you'll double your money. And of course, this continues around the class until you get to the last kid in the class who doesn't have anybody to sell the piece of paper to, and that's when the chain letter falls apart. That's why chain letters are illegal. Charles Ponzi in the 20s ran a famous chain letter, and with Italian Americans that he knew were or he can't, that started trusting him because of word of mouth. Then Bernie Madoff did the same thing during before the Great Recession, and then was discovered during the Great Recession that it was a chain letter that he was running. So these always end badly, and we've been running these with respect to Social Security, Medicare, taken from young people, given to old people, telling young people, when you're old, you'll be able to get your Social Security money from your kids. Same thing with Medicare. There's never been any real funding of these programs. It's also the same with Medicaid. Medicaid is a program to give health care to poor people, but 70% or so of the recipients are actually older people living in nursing homes because we don't have a decent nursing home policy. So when people run out of money and need to be in nursing homes, we warehouse them in these pretty awful Medicaid facilities, and we turn to young people to pay the bills, and that's uh, again a Ponzi scheme. Now we've also shifted the tax structure from taxing asset income to taxing wages. So when we give breaks to older people who have wealth on their capital gains, so that if they receive capital gains, they don't have to pay as high a tax rate on that money. Well, who's going to make up the loss of revenues? Implicitly, it's younger people who have wage income. So we've shifted the tax structure from taxing asset income to taxing wage income through time. And of course, a lot of that is taxing the wage income of future generations who are leaving the bill to cover the larger official debt, and also the larger Social Security obligations and the larger Medicare obligations and the Medicaid obligations. And this, of course, interacts with the demographics that we had a baby boom and now we have a baby bust, basically, compared to that. And period in the late 40s and 50s and early 60s, when people were having basically 3 kids. Each couple was having about 3 kids. Now they're having just 2 kids each, and that's means there are fewer young people around to continue with this chain letter. We're getting closer to the end of the classroom, if you like, and more rapidly. So that's a big problem, and it has had ramifications for the economy. You see here in this picture, if you're looking at this podcast as a video, you see debt to GDP has soared in the, going from 1980 till today. It's gone from 30% of GDP to over 120% of GDP. So we're basically heading towards Italian level debt to GDP ratios. Although I think the Italian economy, I'm actually speaking to you from Rome today. I'm having some meetings with the members of the Italian government to help them look at their long-term fiscal situation. I think it's actually much better than ours because they've gotten a hold of these Ponzi schemes and brought them, reduced their size and scope. They've had major, if you like, social security reform, and their healthcare system may not be as good as ours, but they're only spending 6% of GDP on it. We're spending 18%. So when you take from young people, well, young people are savers, and you give to old people are spenders because they're close to the end of their days. So they want to basically spend their money. They have a higher propensity to consume. Younger people, they have a lower propensity to consume. So when you take from them and give to old people, you're taking from savers and giving to spenders. And the national saving rate in our country has gone from about 13% of national income down to 3%. And this has been a gradual trend, and you're looking, if you're watching, to a picture from the Federal Reserve, the national net national saving as a percentage of gross national income, and you see this downhill picture. We are not saving as a nation anymore, and it's because really of this policy that's been taking place decade after decade, year after year, in different forms. Again, it's explicit running deficits, and it's implicit deficit finance, where we basically put the obligations off the books. If I take money from you and tell you and give it to somebody else, take some money from a young person, give it to an old person, and tell the young person, look, here's an IOU, here's a government debt obligation, and when you're old, you can cash that in for some money. And then, of course, I got to go to the next generation to pay interest and principal. That's one thing. At least that is putting the debt on the books. But if I take money from you and tell you, hey, this is a tax I'm taking from you, but I'm going to promise to give you a transfer payment, a government benefit, a Social Security benefit, or a healthcare benefit when you're older. Well, now that transfer payment is not an official obligation. It's off the books, but it's nonetheless an obligation, and it's politically speaking probably a more powerful obligation, because when old people aren't given something they've been promised, they get angry, and they typically go to the polls to a much greater degree than younger people who are working when it comes to election day. So taking from young people and calling the money taxes that you're taking from them, and giving and saying that you're going to make a transfer payment to them in the future, is just changing the words for explicit deficit finance, borrowing from young people, giving them an IOU, and then they're trying to use that IOU to collect in the future. It's just putting the debt off the books, and we have much more debt off the books than we have on the books, unfortunately, in our country. So we've been running disguised deficit finance for decades, and that's the way Congress gets to borrow without anybody really seeing it explicitly, except when we get reports about Social Security going bankrupt, which we've been getting in spades of late. So our domestic investment rate is largely financed by our national saving rate. If you look at these two series, they tend to move together. For some years, we get foreigners to invest in the U.S., but if we're not saving much, then we can't be investing much in our country. And our domestic investment rate out of GDP or national income has fallen from 13% in the 50s, 13.5%, down to 5% in the last decade. From 2010 to 2022, it's been 5.5% as opposed to 13.5% in the 50s, 13.8% in the 60s, 11.9% in the 70s, 10.7% in the 80s, 8.9% in the 90s, 8.5% in the 2000s, early 2000s, and then the last decade, or 2010 to 2022, a little bit longer than the last decade, 12 years, 5.5%. At the same time, our national saving rate has gone from 13.6% in the 50s down to 3.2% in the last 12 years. And during this period, we've run some huge current account deficits. For example, in the early 2000s, we ran the current account, the investment that foreigners did in the U.S., it was 5.7% of national income. They actually invested almost as much in the U.S. as Americans invested in the U.S. Well, actually, they invested more, because out of the 8.5% total domestic investment rate, 5.7 percentage points of the 8.5 was coming from foreigners. So we're letting foreigners invest in our country because we're not saving enough to invest on our own. And that's, of course, a prescription for having foreigners own our U.S. wealth down the road. And that's increasingly happening. At the same time, we've had some increase in per capita GDP, some productivity growth, nothing to really write home again about, but we've also had massive wage inequality. Median weekly real earnings have stagnated in the post-war. They're not a whole lot higher than they were. Well, they're actually, if you look at this picture that I'm looking at from this Federal Reserve, the index was 410 back in 1980. Today, the index of real weekly earnings is about 400. So on this picture, in this measure, median real weekly earnings just have not increased in over 40 years. So that's not the American dream. That's the American nightmare. For some people, for a lot of people above the median, real wages have risen. So we've had major increases in inequality, and you see that in this next slide. The top 1% have seen since 1980 138% increase in their annual real pay, whereas the bottom 90% have seen a 15% increase. And of course, the people below the at the median and below the median have seen, in other words, the bottom 50% have seen either no real wage increase or a decline. This is why you have so many families with double earners, double income families, people working multiple jobs, parents not being able to take care of their kids because they're working 2 jobs and both spouses are working. So, and a lot of people not getting married and not coupling up. Well, not getting married because the benefit system works against getting married, because if you get married, you lose benefits galore. You can lose housing benefits, food stamps, welfare benefits, Medicaid, medical benefits for poor people. There's a major taxes on getting married that I've been studying with other economists of late, and we'll be putting out a study on that. So this is the truth as opposed to the fiction that you heard during the election from both sides about the economy. You just didn't hear how bad things actually are for most people and how we need to change things. Social Security has off the book debt of $63 trillion. That's tucked away in table Roman 6F1 in the trustees report. There's a number that shows that the unfunded liability, if you look at all the projected outlays of Social Security and you subtract all the projected receipts, and you do this in present value, so you get the economic measurement correctly. So it's not just looking at the obligations, but it's looking at the resources the system has coming in that are designated to go to Social Security. Well, we're talking about $63 trillion according to the actuaries. I'm not sure they're doing the right discounting or using the right discount rate, but I would use a much higher discount rate. But the basic story is, according to them, that we're short 2 years of GDP, slightly more than 2 years of GDP to cover all the benefits. So unless we cut benefits dramatically or raise taxes dramatically for Social Security, it could be payroll taxes or some other taxes, we're going to have to cut Social Security benefits. And we'll get back to that in a bit. You can see in this chart that the projections are that things will even get worse here with respect to our fiscal finances. This is a chart from the CBO showing outlays growing dramatically and revenues hardly increasing between now and 30 years from now. by mid-century. Then you see another chart here, official debt relative to GDP. This is on the book debt, growing from roughly, if you go to from the if you look at our current situation, we're at about 100% of official debt to GDP, going up to 158%. So this is debt held by the public. It subtracts out debt that's been purchased back by the Federal Reserve. So that's maybe not the standard number that you're used to looking at, but the chart is showing a massive increase in debt to GDP between 1962, when it was close to zero, up till now, through 2054, when it's supposed to be 158% of GDP. Italy's official debt to GDP is around 130%. So we have huge issues there. Let me talk about Social Security again. In 2033, that's less than 10 years from now, the system is scheduled to run out of cash, and we're going to need a 21% benefit cut from 2033 on, permanent benefit cut, 21%. If we don't do something to keep that from happening, under President Trump's proposal, particularly not to tax Social Security benefits under the federal income tax, that makes the situation worse. And we run out of money in 2031, and we need not a 21% benefit cut, but a 33% benefit cut. If you wanted to try and fix the entire Social Security system through time, because the situation actually, gets worse, that calculation that I just talked to you about was actually optimistic, because it only looks at trying to salvage the system for the next 75 years. But after 75 years, on a cash flow basis, things get actually worse. That's why we have a $63 trillion number, why it's so big. And to really cover that $63 trillion in present value, we need a 36% hike in the 12.4% payroll tax for Social Security. So we need to add 4.5 percentage points to the 12.4 percentage point payroll tax rate that we're paying in every week's and every month's payroll stub. We see a FICA tax that's 12.4% of our pay. Yes, the employer sends in half the check, and then he nominally for themselves, and then pays the other half, sends in the other half of the check for us. But both halves of the check are being mailed by the employer to the IRS for Social Security payroll tax payments. And then there's this lie that half of it's being paid by the employer. Well, the employers are not our friends, they're not our parents, they're not our grandparents, they're not paying taxes on our behalf. If they mail some money on our behalf to the federal government, they're taking it out of our pay, whether it's called the employer half or the employee half. We're paying both halves, which is now 12.4. And if we wanted to shore up Social Security immediately, we would have to forever, according to the trustees' calculation, we would have to raise the payroll tax today to 16.9%, up to almost 17%, and keep it there forever to make Social Security permanently solvent. The Trump's proposed policies, I say here in the slide, be careful what you wish for. It looks like he's going to win both the House and the Senate. The Republicans will win, in which case he's going to be obligated to follow through on what he promised. And I think he might have been counting for for the Democrats to retain the House, in which case they could vote against some of his proposed policies, which are going to make the fiscal situation even worse and our economy even worse. But that's not likely to happen. So he's going to have to deliver, I believe, on what he's promised, because he won't have any excuse for not doing so. So what has he promised? He wants to make the tax cut, the TCJA, Tax Cut and Jobs Act, permanent, which is going to cost money. He wants to increase benefits or tax deductions for rich people. That's the SALT limitation. He wants to undo the SALT limitation in the TCJA. He doesn't want to tax tips. That's supremely nuts, in my view. That's also something that Harris was suggesting, equally nuts for her to suggest it, in large part because it's going to make waiters and other people that are relying on tips worse off, because they're not going to be paying taxes, therefore they're not going to get credit for Social Security contributions. And for them, the benefits from Social Security that they get for making those contributions are going to exceed their tax contributions because of how progressive the benefit formula is. So nobody actually thought through whether this would actually help waiters and waitresses and other people living on tips. Never discussed. Don't tax Social Security benefits. That's part of his proposals. Don't tax overtime pay. Reduce the corporate tax rate down from about 21% to 15%. Provide deductions for auto loans. And how do you pay for all this? Well, you put a 20% tariff on all imports. That's basically the same rate, maybe a little bit lower than we had during the Great Depression under the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So we're talking about a trade war because other countries are going to raise tariffs on us, and that's going to mean that we're going to have trouble exporting goods to them, and they're going to have trouble exporting goods to us. About 15% of our 16% of our GDP represents imports. Well, I mean, GDP is what we produce, but we're importing relative to GDP about 16% of, well, imports represent about 16% of GDP. Exports are about the same share of GDP. So we're talking about a big chunk of our economy that we both on the consumption side and the production side. And we're also talking in Trump's case about a 60% tax on 60% tariff on Chinese imports. And he's also threatened to make that 100% or even 200%. Now, that of course could lead to China invading Taiwan tomorrow. When we put on an embargo on Japanese oil prior to World War II, they decided to go to war with us. So this could lead China to say, well, what's the cost of our invading Taiwan? We don't think the US military is going to be able to defend Taiwan, so let's consequently go ahead and take it over. And that could lead to some kind of a war. It's, I think, a dangerous thing to do, just to out of the blue talk about raising tariffs and claiming that this is not going to land on the American consumer. It's a highly regressive fiscal policy to be increasing tax breaks to rich people and raising tariffs, which are akin to sales taxes that everybody pays, including our young workers. So there are estimates that this will raise official debt to GDP by another 10 percentage points. So in 2054, we're talking about debt to GDP not being 158%, but 174%. So the Trump tariffs could raise prices by 3%. They could produce a 5% inflation for at least for a year or so. They're regressive. They could spark a trade war. They could lead to higher interest rates. The Federal Reserve could overreact to them. they could cause a recession. And again, they could cause China to invade Taiwan. So I don't think this is all that well thought out. Maybe Trump wants to use this as a threat to China and other countries to do what the U.S. wants China to do, and maybe that will work. But he tried some of this in the first term, and it didn't really work. So I don't see why it's going to work the second time around. Could they turn around manufacturing having such high tariffs? Well, manufacturing share of employment was a little bit above 8% when Trump took office. By the time he left office, it was closer to 7%, and today it is around 7%. So it continued to decline under Biden. We are just not a manufacturing country anymore. Back in 1950, 30% of output was being produced by manufacturing. Sorry, 30% of employment was in manufacturing. Today it's 7%. So this is just not in the cards that our country is going to be producing leaf blowers that I can buy from China through Amazon for $70, and they're fantastic machines. I just bought one the other day. It would take an American company, probably a good, it's much more expensive. We'd have to have much more expensive labor to produce that leaf blower, and probably we would use robots to make and smart machines to make that leaf blower, as opposed to hiring workers to do it, because we couldn't be competitive. So I think there's a fallacy here that never got discussed during the election, that we're not a manufacturing country. Factories are just not in the cards anymore. We have empty factories all over the country. What do we really need? Well, I ran for president as a write-in candidate back in 2016 in order to put forth an agenda for reform that economists would favor. And I talked to a lot of economists before I wrote this up. It's called the book, which has my platform, is posted at kotlikov.net. It's called You're Hired. It's not called You're Fired. And it talks about reducing healthcare spending in the U.S. from 17% down to, which it is now, to about 11% of GDP, which other countries can produce very good healthcare outcomes, far better than ours. For 11% of GDP, we're spending 17, 18% and getting second-rate healthcare outcomes. I would freeze the current Social Security system, pay off everything we owe under the current system, fill zeros in the earnings records of people going forward, but then adopt a personal security account system, which has everybody's contributions invested in a global equity fund, a global index fund of stocks, bonds, and real estate funds, not run by Wall Street, but run by my laptop at no cost to the American public. Everybody would get the global market return. Everybody would get paid off in the form of annuities. There would be government contributions that would be helping poor people and unemployed people and disabled people. So everybody would have a personal security account. They would have a guarantee that at retirement age, their account was at least equal to what they put in, adjusted for inflation. So they have a floor to the return of at least zero. And this is what I think we would have, if we were going to start Social Security from scratch, this is what I think would be the case, that this would be a modern Social Security system. And that's what we need to think about, reforming Social Security from scratch, not taking an 88-year-old system and trying to patch it up. And it's one that's fiscally broke. We could, in the process of paying off the accrued liabilities, lower the payroll tax somewhat and then gradually have it decline. So, okay, so that's my idea for Social Security. I think we need to have fundamental tax reform because most people are being locked into poverty by our tax benefit system. We need to fix our benefit system as well. We have for poor people, many of them, I'm talking about maybe a third, facing confiscatory taxes if they work more, if they switch careers, if they try and become entrepreneurs. We've locked the poor into poverty for decades, and we need to turn that around. We also have very high marginal tax rates on high earning people. So we need to have an entirely new fiscal tax system. I would get rid of the federal income tax, the corporate income tax, and raise the payroll tax rate. So it started not, I would start at around $45,000, not at $0. So leave everybody with about a 30% tax on their wages, not having some people facing significant subsidies on working up to a point, and other people facing confiscatory taxes. We've seen in some of my studies with co-authors, people facing marginal tax rates of over 20,000%. They're in brackets over 20,000% because if they earn more money, they lose food stamps, healthcare benefits, Medicaid benefits for themselves and their kids, not just this year, but in the future. If they save some of the extra $1,000, they lose welfare benefits, they lose housing benefits. It's really not even being discussed and not even being examined. We also need a banking system that doesn't leave these banks highly leveraged. We need what's called a mutual fund banking system, what I call limited purpose banking. I've written about that. We also need to fix our educational system by having online free education from K to 12. And that's what the Department of Education is here to do, and they've done none of it. They have no courses on their website. We should have every single course being taught by many excellent teachers in different ways so that kids can have headsets and spend half the day potentially, or some part of the day, listening to the very best and watching the very best teachers deliver high school algebra and every other course. We rank 18th on the international rankings of educational achievement by our kids, 18th, and that's what's called the PISA score. So at a personal level, I think we all need to realize that we're not planning for retirement in a systematic manner. We need to we need to realize that Uncle Sam is not here to take care of us. Uncle Sam is here to put us into trouble and has done that for decades. Uncle Sam is here to get reelected. So we need to do personal saving. We're coming into retirement with far too little money, most of us, and retirement's a very long time. We're counting on dying on time. We could make it to 100. So we have to take control of our personal finances, and that means doing personal financial planning, understanding what is the most that we can spend such that we can keep on spending it, that we can sustain our living standard, and making sure that we don't screw up our Social Security benefit collection, and making sure that we don't leave taxes on the table for the government to take. And that's where I developed a tool called Maxify Planner, Maxifi.com, which lets you do, figure out how much you should be saving, how much you should be spending, and not a dollar more, and how to make decisions about every choice that you have to make, including like when to retire and when to take Social Security, and do it knowing exactly to the dollar what it's going to cost you if you don't make the right decision. So Maxify.com, Maxifi, can really help you make critical decisions and turn your own personal financial situation around, even though I think that nationally speaking, we're in grave danger of continuing down a path that really is very much what Argentina did for a century and has continued, continues to do, which is make things worse. It's not make America great again, it's make America worse again. So that's my slightly depressing post-election prognosis, I just don't see us having a serious adult conversation. We have no members of Congress, 535 members of Congress. None of them have a PhD in economics, and they're all making economic policy. This is like having 535 members of Congress with no education in engineering each build a section of the Brooklyn Bridge. And what would happen is that over time, parts of it would collapse. And that's kind of where we are when it comes to economic policy. So please don't let American politicians screw up your own personal financial lives. Make sure you do as well as possible given the situation. And again, Maxify.com, Maxify.com, only costs $149. The basic tool is $109. It can make, help you save tens of thousands of dollars, could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in higher benefits and lower lifetime taxes. So definitely you'll want to run that. So take care, and let's hope the best for our country and of course our troops who are our young people who are out there every day putting their lives on the line to defend us. I know this sounds like a kind of closing statement of a presidential candidate, but if you're going to say something good about the country, a prayer for the country, we have to say a prayer for our kids, and especially the ones who are defending us. Thank you. Take care.